Anger and outrage spilled into the streets of Atlanta last night. The large crowds gathered to protest police brutality and call for criminal charges after the killing of a black man by an Atlanta police officer. Demonstrators were met head-on by a large group of police officers. They shut down a major highway, were largely peaceful. However, the same can't be said for other scenes in the city. Some demonstrators chose to focus their anger on the site of the shooting, this Wendy's restaurant. It's been reduced to charred rubble. All this adding more fuel to the nationwide conversation about discrimination and racism. Laura McQuillan is tracking the story for us and joins us now. Laura, what's the latest?
Well, we are learning some new details about the police officers involved in this shooting, John, and we also have some new video to share with you. But on the point of those officers, the news came through in the middle of the night that one of them has now been fired. That is Garrett Rolfe, the officer on the left there who fired the shots at Rayshard Brooks, killing him. Now, Rolfe had been a police officer for 7 years with the Atlanta Police. Devin Brosnan, who you see on the right, was the other officer in the incident. He has been placed on administrative leave, but there are calls for charges to be laid as well, and really that call hinges on whether it was an appropriate use of force for police to shoot Brooks. Now, investigators have said that Brooks was holding one of the officers' tasers when he was shot, with some new details coming from the Georgia Bureau of Investigation. They say police were responding to a complaint about a man sleeping in a car that was blocking the drive-through at that Wendy's restaurant, that the man was Brooks and that he received a field sobriety test and a breathalyzer test. Then police moved to arrest him after about 20 minutes of discussion with him. And this is the scene that was filmed by an eyewitness. You can see there is a struggle ensuing there, and Brooks did manage to take the taser from one of the officers during that struggle. He then was running away from that scene. You see a police officer discharge the taser that he was holding as Brooks fled, and then an officer fired shots. Now, all of that was caught on a camera as well, a body camera that had fallen off one of the officers. And I want to show you that now, but I do want to warn you, you may find the video disturbing, so keep that in mind when you watch.
Had about 1.5 drinks, but you don't remember what kind of drinks they were?
No, sir.
All right.
I really don't, Mr. Ross.
All right, I think you've had too much to drink to be driving, so put your hands behind your back for me. Yeah, put your hands behind your back. Hey, stop fighting! Stop fighting! Stop fighting! You're gonna get tased! You're gonna get tased! You're gonna get tased! Stop! Come on, man! Stop! You're gonna get tased! Mr. Ross! Hey! Stop! Stop fighting! Taser! Stop fighting! Hands off the taser! Stop fighting! Oh, 63.
Now, you see the video there, that object in Brooks' hand as he runs is a police officer's taser, but there is, as I mentioned, debate over whether it was warranted to shoot a gun at him as he was holding a non-lethal weapon. That is exactly the call or the message that we have heard from a lawyer for Brooks' family, and here is what he told media.
In Georgia, a taser is not a deadly weapon. That's the law. That's what the cops are trained to do. It's not a deadly weapon. I've had cases where officers have used tasers on victims, and they argue with us in court that tasers aren't deadly, that tasers aren't harmful. You cannot have it both ways. You can't say he ran off with a weapon that could kill somebody when you say it's not deadly.
Now, as I mentioned, the Georgia Bureau of Investigations is taking a closer look at this, John, and they will pass their information on to the district attorney, and it's up to that district attorney to decide whether to lay charges against those officers.
So all this generating some strong reaction from the community. Laura, what can you tell us about that?
Absolutely. You saw those protests, the burning of a Wendy's restaurant last night. That followed peaceful protests during the early evening, with Brooks' family actually joining the protesters, hundreds of them on the streets. They were sharing a message, Black Lives Matter, also chanting his name. But things got violent as the night wore on. We saw windows smashed, fires lit, police using tear gas and arresting some protesters. That came after Brooks' family urged calm yesterday, and we heard an emotional message from one of his cousins.
I watched this on the internet, from the whole George Floyd situation to us coming together like we doing something, and this whole thing landed on my doorstep with my little cousin. I just think for me, the most hurtful thing for me is to watch the video, wake up and watch that video. And I got 2 little boys. They ain't see the same video. That's their cousin. That's what hurt so much. I thought Atlanta was higher than that. I thought we was bigger than that.
And of course, the backdrop to this, John, is there are huge protests across the United States, across the world, including in Atlanta over the police killing of George Floyd, as you heard Brooks' cousin mention there, and a lot of people now wanting answers and accountability over this latest police shooting.
Thanks for this, Laura. Meanwhile, protesters continue to take to the streets across the U.S., calling for an end to racism and police brutality. In Washington, D.C., demonstrators crowded in front of the mayor's home, calling on the city to defund the police. In Nashville, healthcare workers took part in a march for justice in support of Black Lives Matter, and hundreds marched across a major interstate in Seattle in what they called a bridge to the future. That protest was led by the wives of 2 professional football players who say they were moved to action by the death of George Floyd. For her thoughts, we spoke earlier this morning with Kenesha Grant in Washington, D.C. She's a professor of American politics at Howard University.
I am sad, and I think that many Black Americans are sad. I think that what this tells us is that the police must clearly feel under attack. They are clearly not participating in what should be a revolution in policing at least, but a revolution, best case scenario, in the way that we do politics and race in this country, and that they are not willing to change, and that it is time to think about how we deal with them differently and how we can organize our society such that Black people don't die for doing things like falling asleep at a local fast food restaurant.
We are seeing the protests in the streets. We are seeing the needle being moved on public opinion, not just in the Black community, but in many other areas of the American public in terms of their opinion and their desire for change. You talk about the lack of involvement of police in the debate. So how do you translate that public opinion into action?
I think that we are going to have to be very imaginative moving forward. And so one of the things that I think is important is this conversation about defunding and abolishing the police. I think that the defund the police thing is kind of a misnomer, and so people have been confused about exactly how that works. But what it essentially means is that somebody would have called a tow truck or some social service instead of calling the police on Mr. Brooks yesterday. And so I don't really know what to do to change the minds of police officers. I think it might be the case that the change has to start in government. It has to start with the people, and that the police have to follow behind eventually. And if they can't follow behind, that we find ways to change policing such that they have less power than they currently have, because they're not very good stewards of the power they have right now.
It's Kenesha Grant in Washington. She's a professor of American politics at Howard University.